Hey everyone, I'm excited and daunted right now to talk about my first nonfiction history book in quite a while, and also the largest book I've read in several years. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich ranks among the most popular historical nonfiction books of all time. If you frequently read history, especially recent history written from an American perspective, you've almost certainly come across this work before. At the end of 2023, for example, I had the privilege of visiting the U.S.'s World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is really well done. I definitely recommend visiting it if you ever have the chance. And the author, William Shirer, the author of this book, was mentioned in the very first room of the first exhibit there, which was giving a background on the global history leading up to the outbreak of war. William Shirer was an American journalist who, among other things, covered the rise of Nazi Germany from inside the German nation throughout most of the regime's existence. That regime existed in 1933 up through 1945, so it started several years before a full worldwide war, or really even any war, broke out, and lasted up until the war's conclusion in 1945. What we get in this book from the author is a combination of his identity as an American who has quite a critical perspective on Germany. I'll talk more about that later. I mean, not just on the Nazi party, as we might expect, but also on the German people and the whole situation leading up to the party's rise, as well as first-hand account from living and observing Germans in Germany on the days of crucial events, such as Germany's declaration of war against Britain and France, or the first bombing of Berlin by the Allied forces. Thus, Shirer's account is an insider account by location and an outsider account by political and national affiliation. Also, he does rely heavily on historical documents and evidence, but he is a journalist, and this book reads somewhere more like a cross between journalism and academic historic nonfiction. I'll say a bit more on what that means shortly, but in some ways I think this journalistic flair is probably responsible for much of the book's success, actually. The writing is incredibly detailed, but generally doesn't feel esoteric or overly academic, and therefore you don't have to work in a university history department to find his account captivating. Also, I've alluded to it here, and the book's title suggests it as well. This book is focused on Nazi Germany, also called the Third Reich. It's not a comprehensive overview of World War II or of European or global politics during this time period, although these topics do come into play where relevant. The book focuses on this particular regime, the events that led to its creation, how it operated during its existence, and ultimately what its demise looked like. I listened to this one as an audiobook over the period of probably about 6 months, to be honest, leaving time for everything to sink in and allowing for a few dips and surges in my motivation. And the audiobook, read by Grover Gardner, clocks in at 57 hours and 11 minutes. For those of you who are more page-minded, Wikipedia tells me that the book is 1,249 pages, so it's a big one. So is such a big book worth reading? That's one of the more superficial questions I hope to explore in this review/discussion. Normally I'd just say yes, why not? But for a book that's going to consume 2.5 total days of your time, or I guess 4 if you actually sleep, it's certainly worth asking this question before you dive in. Like, you could read 5 to 10 other books in the time it takes you to finish this one. But my short answer is a tentative yes. Basically, if you are the sort of audience this book is intended for, then it's definitely worth reading or at least considering this book. And here I mostly just mean people deeply interested in World War II and the circumstances surrounding it, who are excited rather than bored at the prospect of reading some really in-depth coverage of this period in history. As you might expect, though, I've been working on this book for a long time. Actually, it didn't have to take so long, but I've gone through periods where I read more in bursts, maybe listened to about 10 hours of the period of a week, and other periods where I listened to an hour or two a week, if even that. I'm not sure there's a right or wrong way to do this book, but this was a good way for me, and I likely got more out of it by waiting for the times when I was really most prepared to engage with it, rather than just blazing through. Also, this book is pretty accessible in terms of content, even to someone like myself without a very in-depth prior knowledge of Nazi Germany and World War II. I mean, I do have some background knowledge there. But I find it helps when reading history books to do a fair amount of cross-referencing with Wikipedia articles in particular about the key events and characters, just to start understanding the context and drawing more connections here. Maybe something to talk about on its own video sometime, how I get the most out of history reading, but a little bit besides the point here. I'm going to give an overview and talk about what I like best before delving into criticisms, but there are a few important and sometimes criticized points that I need to mention up front because they're important context for engaging with the material in this book. First of all, the author, William Shirer, was a journalist as opposed to an academic historian. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. In some ways it could be an advantage, but it means that his perspective on the war is not necessarily reflective of prevailing views at the time within the community of academic historians. He wasn't fully immersed in that world, despite his reliance on many of the same sources. Secondly, this work was published in 1960. It was only 15 years after the end of the war, and now at the time of recording this video in 2024, over 5 times as much time has passed since the end of World War II in 1945 than had passed when the book was written. In other words, we as a global community had only 20% of the time for reflection and contextualization that we've had now. And furthermore, there were some historical details that Shirer just didn't have full access to yet. Now, to the author's credit, he's very upfront about this limitation in the preface to the book, but he still finds that it is worth telling the story even just 15 years after the end of the war, and I agree. Finally, one more point that bears repeating. Shirer was an American by nationality. He lived in various parts of the world, including Nazi Germany for a time, but being an American certainly informs his overall perspectives on the war. So together, all the pieces of context I've just mentioned speak to the fact that despite its length and detail, this is not a comprehensive or definitive account of the war, and there never will be such an account. So let's not take it as ultimate truth, but as one window, a very, very large window, into the operations of the Third Reich. Okay, let's get deeper into the meat of the book now. The book is chunked into 6 major parts, which vary in length. You could actually probably pick up the book and read just one part if interested, because the book is pretty well sectioned off into different aspects of the whole historical narrative, from the roots of the Nazi Party and Hitler's ideology to the aftermath of the war in Germany after the nation's defeat. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way, but you could, especially if you already have extensive background on the topic. The first part of the book is called The Rise of Adolf Hitler, and it deals not only with a brief introduction to the future Führer and his ideas, but also to the broader social movements that shaped him in his youth, as well as the political context and history of Germany, and some early attempts of Hitler and the other Nazi Party members to gain influence in Germany, most notably in the now infamous Beer Hall Putsch. A lot of this feels like the coalition building and grassroots organization chapter for Hitler and the Nazi Party. I guess grassroots organization doesn't seem quite right because Hitler was always more interested in being a strong man with powerful allies than truly empowering the common people. In that, he actually differed from some of the other early Nazis. More than anything, this section lays the groundwork for the rest of the book in various different dimensions. Although this is important context, to be honest, I wouldn't say for me it was the most riveting part of the book. At least at the start. So it's worth sticking through for the first few hours, I guess, to see what you think of the main thrust of the book after this part. Like in one of the few chapters in this section, we essentially get an early biography of Hitler, which, though informative in its own way, is not really what this book ends up being about. Later sections will focus less on the biographical details of Hitler's life, except to the extent to which they influence the overall policies of Nazi Germany. Likewise, this section briefly explores many of the racial ideologies and pro-German nationalism that were prevalent at the time in certain communities, especially in Austria, where Hitler was living for a while, and that he then eventually outlined in his own flavor in his book Mein Kampf. I likewise appreciated this summarization, but again, just not my favorite part of the book, kind of like an extended prologue, if anything. Some important takeaways for me from this section, though. First of all, Hitler's ideology was not particularly new and was shaped by the community in which he lived and even by some of his childhood history teachers. Despite the diplomatic lies he would later tell during the early years of Nazi Germany about simply wanting peace for Germany, his eventual expansionistic push for Lebensraum, or living space, for Germany was laid out all right from the start, along with his racial ideology in Mein Kampf, for those who cared to read it and take him at his word. There were plenty of other individuals and parties jockeying for power in the years after the First World War, and it was likely Hitler's own uncompromising ambition and sense of purpose, along with his charisma and a touch of luck, that helped him to win out over all his other peers and would-be leaders at the time. And finally, Nazism, which was an abbreviation for the National Socialist Party, was never exactly a fully socialist party, but there were socialist cliques within it who advocated for not only German nationalism, but also a rise of the working class and a redistribution of wealth. This is important clarification since, as many know, Hitler's eventual Nazi Germany was vehemently opposed to communism, which it saw as a threat to its own supremacy. And the more socialistic members of the party advocating for redistribution of wealth, like the leader of the paramilitary Sturmabteilung, Ernst Röhm, were rooted out once and for all on the infamous Night of the Long Knives, if not sooner. The next section of the book is called Triumph and Consolidation. This is where Hitler and his Nazi allies gained the upper hand and ultimately created a one-party fascist Germany in which Hitler pulled all the strings. We learn about all the compromising and enabling by others in the government, and eventually the executive actions that Hitler took to guarantee that he had complete control and authority over his new empire. Part of this is an exploration of the conditions in Germany at the time that enabled the Nazi Party to gain popularity, some of which is also described in the first section, starting with many Germans' sense of humiliation as well as real economic hardship following World War I under the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty forced Germany to pay large sums of reparation money to the rest of Europe, starting a crisis of hyperinflation, and forbade Germany from building a standing military. I find this all quite fascinating and cautionary because, the first time we as Americans learn about World War II, it starts from a point of clear good guys and bad guys, with Germany starring as the most prominent bad guy. A nation taking over its neighbors, forcing their civilians into slave labor camps, and eventually also carrying out, even somewhat from the start, carrying out genocidal policies against Jews, Slavs, and other minorities. Yet at the start, in the 1920s, Germany under the new Weimar Republic wasn't necessarily an evil empire. It was just another nation of people trying their best to cope with the new economic and political reality following World War I, their place in the European and the world puzzle. This all belies the sort of grade schooler's notion that it's easy to tell a good guy from a bad guy when you see them, or at least that it's easy to tell in what nations these fascist movements are going to take root. Another dimension of this section was the overall weakness of the new republic in Germany, which held nominal authority with its own constitution and everything, but which many Germans still saw as fundamentally an imposition, whether because they wanted to restore the monarchy or because they wanted to impose some other more radical form of government. So as a result, an enormous level of political compromise was required on both sides of the political spectrum. And as it turned out, those leaders who were willing to compromise and build cross-party coalitions were eventually exploited as they ended up conceding more and more of their power to Hitler and the Nazis, who would accept nothing other than complete control of the government. So then we see how Hitler and his allies worked from within the government and by popular support to eventually undermine that government and make constitutional amendments that neutered the existing checks and balances and created a pseudo-constitutional basis for Hitler's complete control of government. While fascism is a complicated, fuzzy, and often overused term these days to the point of having little clear meaning in common conversation, it was certainly a characteristic of so-called fascist governments in the 20th century that they tended to work within and manipulate the existing government to create a semi-legitimate basis of authority founded in the old government, as opposed to, say, just toppling the old government entirely and saying, this is the new government and you will obey me because I have all the tanks and airplanes. You have to remember that Hitler's government was at the beginning elected, even at the time before the elections were totally rigged. And then by enacting certain illiberal laws like the law outlawing parties and the Enabling Act, they gradually changed the rules so that there was simply no way for them to lose power aside from, getting conquered at the end of World War II. Finally, this section of the book also paints a picture of the overall Nazification of Germany, what that looked like for the German people, and how society quickly began to change as laws such as the anti-Jewish laws were enacted and pogroms, or basically murders of large number of Jews, were carried out and sanctioned by the government. We also learn separately of the Night of the Long Knives mentioned previously, in which Ernst Röhm, who wanted to carry out a second revolution to achieve the socialist part of National Socialism, was murdered along with many other prominent Nazi officials, and his stormtroopers or Sturmabteilung were defanged. And there's a bit of discussion here about the early leaders and economic policies of the Hitler government, including how the government began a campaign of secret remilitarization, which then leads into the diplomatic crises that will characterize the next section of the book. There's plenty of food for thought specifically in this second section because it's a study in how liberal governments lose their liberal values, and we can rightly ask ourselves whether we see warning signs or actual execution of such anti-liberalism in our own societies. I tend to err on the side of caution when pointing at events in, for example, the US where I live and screaming fascism at every turn, because I think raising the alarm at everything that happens can basically fatigue anyone listening and make it hard to tell whether the government actually is in danger or whether the values of liberalism are in danger. On the other hand, part of the whole story of the rise of the Third Reich is that many people couldn't really see the course on which things were headed or just didn't want to believe it. And though I still think I've seen fairly limited evidence of overtly fascist tactics employed in the US in recent years, it has become easier for me to see how we're creating a situation in which the fascist toolbox is more readily available, sowing doubt in the legitimacy of elections, trying to remove political opponents through government action rather than the ballot box. I think as someone who's grown up in the most affluent global society in history, it's easy to take for granted the freedoms we have. Well, those freedoms don't even exist everywhere in the world, and nor have many of them existed here in the US for actually that long. So I guess what I'm saying is let's at least take an active mindset in monitoring them and fighting for them with thought instead of letting them slip away. If you're interested in this topic, I also recorded a video several years ago on Sinclair Lewis's novel It Can't Happen Here, the story of a fictional post-World War I America in which a fascist leader rises to power in the US. Not the most riveting novel I've ever read, but good food for thought. I also have even a playlist of videos about books on, I call it, I think, authoritarianism and totalitarianism, which I don't really like as a name at all because these aren't the same thing, but I'll work on that and come up with a different title for that. These are topics that interest me and I think are important for modern global citizens to be familiar with. Now, part 3 of the book is called The Road to War. More than anything, this part is a tale of geopolitical intrigue and diplomacy. Not to mention a fair amount of very clever propaganda and posturing by Hitler and his allies, which prevented other nations and even many Germans themselves from seeing what was really going on here and the probably inevitable final outcome of Hitler's expansionistic policies. We see here how, from the beginning of his actual tenure as Chancellor of Germany, Hitler peddled an image of Germany as an ultimately peaceful nation, but a victim of these oppressive international restrictions, and one that would stand up for itself when provoked. This image of Germany as a victim certainly held sway with many of its people and with a number of outside observers as well. On one hand, the country was aggressively expansionistic in World War I, but on the other hand, the Treaty of Versailles after the war had crippled Germany to an extent such that many Germans were really struggling. Thus, Hitler repeatedly sought out foreign provocations, and when there was no adequate provocation, he sought to agitate or even fabricate evidence of provocation, which he then used as evidence of Germany's moral righteousness or high ground in stepping up to defend itself. And in defending the German people, Hitler's concept of Germany went beyond the existing borders of the German state. His first aggressive foreign policy actions as Chancellor all involved him stepping in to supposedly defend the rights of ethnic Germans across borders. This began with the occupation of the Rhineland, then the annexation or Anschluss of Austria, and the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, which was ostensibly to protect the Sudeten Germans living there, who were allegedly being persecuted. Now, one criticism I have of this part of the book in particular is that I don't think Shirer gives a sympathetic enough portrayal of the sentiments of these ethnic Germans and others living in territories abroad. From reading Shirer's account, it would often seem as if Hitler stepped in and took over these territories in a move that was completely unpopular among all the local residents. I don't mean to defend these occupations. I think they definitely should be viewed critically, especially with the retrospective lens we have right now. However, I know that among some Austrians, the Anschluss was viewed favorably. To some Sudeten Germans living in Czechoslovakia, they did want Hitler to step in and help them. Maybe some Sudeten Germans were actually being persecuted. I can't attest to how common or rare such sentiments were, but Shirer here seems largely to dismiss such perspectives and brush them aside as a minority, focusing on how the broader historical narrative took shape here. Nevertheless, I'm sure there's other material nowadays exploring these perspectives, which could be interesting for me to read sometime, or feel free to leave a comment yourself if you know any more about this. Another big theme in this part of the book is the British's and the French's, and really the broader Western world's policy of appeasement. At some point, the leaders of these nations were certainly getting some clue as to what Hitler's goals were, as the Fuhrer repeatedly swept up just one more piece of land. But in this part of the book, and I think in the view of many historians to this day, the other big dogs in Europe come across as extremely weak, just allowing Hitler to have his way when he could have been stopped, actually. A long section of the book about events leading to the Munich Agreement shows how Britain and France basically turned their backs on a previous diplomatic commitment to Czechoslovakia, and after much hemming and hawing about coming to Czechoslovakia's rescue, eventually just gave Hitler permission to start nibbling away at the neighboring nation on its own terms, and basically destroying the concept of Czechoslovakia as a unified nation at all. And this is just one chapter in a long litany of events in this section in which British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in particular comes across as an extremely weak diplomatist who held all the cards but was too afraid to play any of them, and thus enabled the growth of the Third Reich, not just geographically but also economically and militarily. So we can look back on this policy of appeasement and view it as a complete moral and diplomatic failure, but we can also try to understand the prevailing sentiments of the time and the factors that shaped these leaders' decisions. Shirer does a bit of both, but he certainly comes down very critically against the appeasers, maybe fairly. In this section of the book, though, what kept coming to my mind the most was a book on international relations I read a year or two ago by John Mearsheimer called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Among other things, that book outlines a theory of international relations that Mearsheimer subscribes to called political realism, which you might have also heard of in its German form, Realpolitik. The book itself is not the origin of this term, which goes back quite a ways before Mearsheimer. He rather uses this book to develop and extend upon certain aspects of this theory to explain his own theory of offensive realism, the details of which are beyond the scope of this review. I found that book very interesting, if a bit long and often repetitive. It's quite an academic book, and although I agree with much of Mearsheimer's assessment, I think he often goes a little too far in trying to fit everything nicely into a single framework, suggesting that certain political behaviors are more predictable than they really are, in situations where there really are many viable possibilities that could play out. Nevertheless, one particularly valuable aspect of that book is that he analyzes in detail the geopolitical calculations involved in several historical examples, including the rise of Nazi Germany. And I do think that analyzing the behavior of the European leaders in this context is quite illustrative of many of the realist principles he's describing there. So I'm going to digress a bit here, but in general, political realists say, look, a lot of modern thinkers understand nations operating in a way shaped by liberalism and national values. You know, they value democracy and liberalism as foundations of a healthy society, and they regard highly the human rights of their own citizens and also, to some extent, foreign citizens. And they wage war or determine foreign policy in a way largely influenced by safeguarding these values for their own citizens and for the citizens of other nations to the extent possible. Under this model, you would expect that a nation like the US would be allied and come to support liberal and democratic governments in foreign nations while fighting against autocracy or dictatorship. But political realists like Mearsheimer say, no, that's a nice idealistic story, and it's one that nations like to use to explain their actions. Hitler did it himself, although the value system he used to justify expansion was a very different one based on the supremacy of the German people. But generally, if you look at how governments actually behave in foreign policy, it's a game of risk. You basically sit around the table and you say, who can I conquer and who can conquer me? When your ally is being attacked, you ask yourself, if I don't intervene and if this conflict proceeds to expected conclusion, am I in a stronger or a weaker position? If the answer is weaker, you intervene. But if the answer is stronger, you just let things run their course and send some nice excuse to your ally about how you really would love to help them because democracy and best wishes, but you're just not really ready to take part in this one, and then you just let things run their course. And the object is, of course, as any risk player knows, global domination. Except in Mearsheimer's telling, there's a bit of an exception there, because global domination, or global hegemony, as he calls it, is not really a possible option in today's world. The logistical difficulties of waging war across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean are such that it's virtually impossible for a country to be so strong as to gain the upper hand in such a conflict, because the home soil defender in that situation is always going to have such a major advantage if all resources are really even mildly comparable. So instead, nations aspire to become regional hegemons, to become far and away the strongest nation in their area of the world, such as Europe. In fact, the United States is currently a regional hegemon. This isn't to say that the US has conquered the entire Americas, that's not exactly the point, but the US has vastly superior military power in its realm and would be nearly impossible to conquer in the present global climate. Therefore, in this status quo, it really gets to call all the shots in the Americas. And this also gives it some sway across the oceans as well, because it can influence the other nations in its sphere of hegemony in their dealings with these distant powers. Where am I going with this tangent? Well, the main geopolitical objective of nations is to become a regional hegemon, and certainly that's going to be difficult if someone else is a regional hegemon. So your second objective is to prevent anyone else from becoming a regional hegemon. So if someone else is taking military actions, but they're not threatening to become a regional hegemon, you don't really care that much if it doesn't seem to affect your own chances of becoming a regional hegemon. Oh, but wait, there's another catch. Even if someone is threatening to become a regional hegemon, you still might not need to do anything about it. Because what you know is that every other nation is still taking the same coldly rational approach to politics that you take. Therefore, if I'm Mr. Chamberlain sitting over here in Parliament in Britain and saying, looks like Germany is trying to become a regional hegemon, but it's actually pretty hard to attack and take over Britain because they have to cross the English Channel, and if I were to send in all my troops right now to stop Germany, then I would be paying the bill for this conflict. But if I look over at Mr. Stalin in the Soviet Union, that really would be a serious situation for him if Germany took over all of Western Europe. So I'm going to take the gamble that I actually don't need to get involved here, and if worse comes to worse, then Stalin will get involved and he'll take down Hitler, and then we can come in with backup to save the day and save democracy once Stalin and Hitler decimate each other's armies, and maybe we'll even get part of Berlin as a reward. So this one's on Stalin. Thanks, bro. Unfortunately, Mr. Stalin is also sitting over there in the Kremlin or wherever it is that Soviet premiers sit, doing similar calculations and saying, Mr. Hitler would be insane to attack me because Britain and France know I'm too weak to win, so they would have to get involved to save their own necks, which means Hitler would have to fight a war on both fronts. The problem is I'm not really sure how soon Britain and France would actually get involved. They might just let things play out for a while to make me weaker, because then at the end of the day they can come out as top dogs after we all conquered Germany and I sustain the heaviest losses. So I'm going to send my foreign ambassador, Mr. Molotov, over to talk it out with Hitler's guy, Mr. Ribbentrop, and see if maybe we can work out a deal where we won't attack each other and Hitler can just take care of Britain and France first, which is going to be good for me, I think. And then by the time he gets around to finally fighting me, I'll have built up a Red Army so strong that as long as we can hold off Hitler until the winter, the softy German soldiers will never be able to match us. It'll be Napoleon all over again. Okay, I'm almost done. Then there's the USA. From Mr. Roosevelt's point of view, the situation over in Europe is very lamentable, but let's face it, we're not under attack ourselves by Germany, because there's this whole ocean that they have to worry about if they were to attack us. And Mr. Churchill, Mr. Stalin, and Mr. Hitler will surely be able to work things out, because although I don't want any of them to become a regional hegemon, they don't want any of them to become a regional hegemon either, so they will balance each other out. But have you heard about the New Deal? My domestic policies are excellent. Vote for me for another term, and I will make sure that the government is doing everything that it can to help the American people. Mearsheimer's point here is that this is the way he thinks nations actually decide their foreign policy. Nowhere in this assessment was it relevant that Hitler's Third Reich was a totalitarian, illiberal regime, nor was it relevant that even if knowledge at the time about the extent of Hitler's war crimes may have been more limited, it was also far from a complete secret, partly because Hitler, as I've already mentioned, was really just doing exactly what he said he was going to do when he published his book, which was now a bestseller in the Third Reich for some reason. Now, you might say that this realist approach to politics is cynical and heartless, to which Mearsheimer would probably say, and I might agree with him, maybe so, but it's realistic. Part 4 of the book is called Early Victories and the Turning Point. In this section, we get some continuation of the diplomacy and negotiating that characterized the previous section, but there's a key difference. The war has now begun. We're no longer trying to prevent a war from happening or pretending to be trying to prevent a war from happening. We're now setting up alliances and strategies. For the military strategists out here, or simply those who enjoy a nice game of Axis and Allies, this will be your section of the book. Though I'll point out that if you're really interested in getting into the weeds of different military campaigns and specific battles, this book isn't going to go quite as deep as you're going to find elsewhere. Instead, Shirer explores the information and calculations that went into different decisions, the rationale and effects of key battles, and how Germany's power shifted with each successive victory or defeat. And in this section of the book, the answer there is going to be that Germany's power was largely growing with almost every movement of troops. Only at the very end of this section, called the turning point, did German troops finally start to hit up against serious adversity in what initially looked like it would be a decisive victory in Soviet Russia as well. And by that point, Hitler had real or de facto control over most of Europe already. There's also this guy named Benito Mussolini that's worth mentioning at some point in this review. I don't know much at all about politics in Italy or about life in World War II at the time, and that's not the domain of this book, but this guy comes across in this book as almost some comedic supervillain in his sheer level of incompetency. I mean, I know it's not funny because this is actual war we're talking about here in a real nation home to millions of people affected by the man's policies, but whenever Mr. Mussolini appears in this book, it's in a capacity where he's really nervous about finding some way to weasel out of joining the war on Hitler's side, which he imagines would surely spell doom for him, and probably would spell doom for him. And he always does find his way out. It seems as if Hitler is just glad to have this guy not fighting on the other side. I'm not sure if this is because Shirer's portrayal of him here is excessively dismissive, or if he really was pretty much just along for the ride the whole way with no real prospects of ever actually achieving anything for himself. But he basically comes across here as Hitler's puppet, and not a particularly good one, whom Hitler could cast aside at any point, and who Hitler knew to be basically completely unreliable, but for whom Hitler, for some strange reason of personality, actually in Schirer's portrayal had some amount of fondness. Part 5 is called The Beginning of the End. Having just concluded the chapter titled The Great Turning Point, the fall part of the rise and fall of the Third Reich is now about to begin. But that's properly in Part 6. Part 5 is actually more of an interlude with mishmash of a few separate topics that the author found worth covering but didn't fit very cleanly into the other sections. The first and most broadly important of the 3 chapters in Part 5 is called The New Order. Heads up for viewers, I'm going to be talking about war crimes for a few minutes here. The chapter is fairly long and describes many of the various horrific crimes committed by Nazis against their enemies, and in particular against the Jewish people. I wouldn't say there was anything in this section that was a complete surprise to me, given that I've learned some about this in the past, but there certainly is a lot of detail given about all the different crimes the Nazis committed. And this section is one I found definitely uncomfortable, even as someone who has read a fair amount of history on this topic. Part of the discomfort is just my sadness at what actually happened, and I guess another part of it is just discomfort that so many people could be such complete failures as human beings as to commit this sort of crime. I'm not even talking about the more complicated situations here, like German citizens who went along with the authoritarian government and maybe regretted their actions later. We could debate the level of guilt of various people, but I'm talking more at this moment about the head honchos who knew what was going on and who were in positions high enough that they should have known better. So in this section, there's, of course, the Holocaust, euphemistically referred to by the Nazis as the final solution to the Jewish question, which readers will already know of, but is still always disturbing to revisit, particularly when hearing, for example, the cold accounts of leaders trying to optimize the efficiency of their exterminations, or of German companies competing for contracts to outfit these death camps with the most effective materials. And some of the companies you'll hear that were allied with the Nazis in Hitler's Third Reich are still companies that exist to this day. Now, the reason why I'm dwelling on the perpetrators of the Holocaust here as opposed to the victims is that's really the perspective we get in this book. I mean, there are excellent writings focusing more on the personal perspective. Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, Elie Wiesel's Night are a few of the most famous ones I read in school. But what stands out in this book is the impersonality of it all from the Nazi leaders and enablers, just treating it as cold business, aside from these occasional outbursts of rage or offhand violent remarks that were recorded. But there's a lot more in this section as well than just the death camps, and the victims extended even beyond the Jews, although they were certainly the main target to the very end. Against his eastern enemies in the war, Hitler really carried out a war of extermination, and the Poles and the Russians were particular victims of this. Hitler simply wanted their land or living space, or Lebensraum as he called it, and during the invasion of the Soviet Union, he ordered his generals to kill everyone in their path and to leave no survivors, explicitly and flagrantly flouting international law, which had been established in recent years. Hitler basically told his subordinates, look, it's only a war crime if you're subject to enforcement by the international community, which of course he did not plan to be because he planned for Germany to be the community of Europe. Additionally, in the conquered territories to the east, there existed what were called Einsatzgruppen, literally deployment groups, but you could think of them as death squads. Their function was basically to round up enemies of the Nazi regime, which included, of course, Jews, but also intellectual or religious leaders in the conquered communities, Romani people, mentally ill people, etc. This was in fact the precursor to what would become what most of us think of as the Holocaust, which with actual concentration camps and death chambers. And part of the eventual switch over to death camps was apparently that many of the people forced to carry out the killings were so psychologically damaged afterwards that the Einsatzgruppen were no longer seen as viable for Nazi leadership. Then you also had scientific experiments carried out on prisoners and Jews, which maybe some of them were meant to discover something useful, not that it would justify the experiments anyway, but Shirer points out that often they seem just more like sadistic and totally unnecessary forms of torture for dehumanized victims. This actually was one of the most gruesome parts to read about in the section. Following the war, although it's not described in the book, the Nuremberg Code was formulated specifically to establish an international ban on certain unethical research practices conducted in the name of science, specifically experimenting on human subjects. It requires a lot of institutional review now. So that's a big piece of part 5. I don't exactly have any additional readings to recommend for learning more about survivors' perspectives on the experiences other than the few I mentioned earlier, and Frank's Diary of a Young Girl and Elie Wiesel's Night, which are both excellent, but I know there's a lot more out there, and these are just the ones they gave us to read in school, presumably because they were written in a way that was understandable for young people learning about these events for the first or second time. Now, switching gears, in the same part of the book, Part 5, we also have a chapter about an ultimately rather inconsequential but fascinating story in its own right. One that's actually been simmering fruitlessly in the background throughout the rest of the book. The plot to kill Hitler. From the early years preceding the war, when it became clear that Hitler, aside from whatever mad Nazi beliefs he had, was also about to plunge the country into international war, and then throughout the war, as it began and progressed, there always existed some groups of conspirators, as Shirer calls them, who have been talking among themselves and for whatever reason saying, this Hitler guy is out of his mind, we need to do something to stop him. This sort of talk is highly illegal under the Nazi government, of course, but it was still going on among some of Hitler's top officials, many of whom were playing this sort of double game, trying to make sure that they were on the winning side. Now, Schirer's portrayal of these men is quite cynical throughout the whole book, at best depicting a few of them as principled but ultimately too cowardly to take any real action, and at worst suggesting them to be these would-be ruthless opportunists who are trying to play both sides of the game but lack the confidence to actually oppose Hitler even in the moments when they hold the greatest advantage. I might argue that Shirer doesn't give enough credit, though, to the fact that it can be quite tricky to self-organize when the normal communication methods are under surveillance and you don't even know who to trust. So maybe there are reasons that these plotters never really had managed to accomplish anything by the late years of the war. Certainly it doesn't help anyone to come out and attempt some sort of a coup, but then have the other people who were supposed to join, stay home because they were too afraid, which did happen a couple times earlier in the Nazi regime. In any case, most of the episodes of this plotting to overthrow Hitler's government throughout the book come across almost comical in their incompetence and seeming half-heartedness. You have these situations where the generals are all agreed that Hitler's going too far and he's got to go, we need to arrest him, but then they can't agree about which one of them is actually going to be the one who shows up and arrests him. No one wants to be the one to make the first move, and then the person who's finally decided ends up with like a weak excuse for why this time isn't actually going to work for them. Like they happen to be called out of town or something pretty silly like that. However, in this section of the book, the plot to kill Hitler actually gets closer than I would have expected. The lack of coordination, as we see in the final episode here, does get to be a problem when it actually comes to the seizing of government, but the actual deed of killing the leader requires a lot fewer things to align. It turns out people actually came quite close to assassinating Hitler on several different occasions, sometimes failing only due to certain strokes of bad luck. Apparently, in those days, the types of bombs that the assassins were using, which was usually the method of assassination, were pretty unreliable. Like, chemicals could fail to react appropriately. On the other hand, I learned that Hitler was crazy good at dodging assassination attempts. He maintained an erratic schedule with constantly changing plans specifically for this reason. So there were a number of times when someone showed up at a meeting armed with a 10-minute time bomb, like ready to set it off, but the meeting was shortened to 5 minutes or postponed for like another hour or something like that so that the plotters were thwarted. All in all, like I said, probably this is all mostly inconsequential in the end, but it's a really interesting section of the book. By the way, though, it's also worth mentioning at this point that by the time people were really getting close to killing Hitler, the war was basically already lost at this point. The D-Day invasion of Normandy had happened, American and British troops were rapidly pushing forward, the Soviets had rallied in the East, everyone knew that Germany was eventually going to lose. But Hitler was extremely attached to this no-surrender mentality, which is one great final tragedy to this whole war. Since it was treasonous to suggest that maybe Germany should surrender now rather than lose even more soldiers' lives, ordinary German troops were forced to keep continuing this losing battle with little morale or chance of victory remaining. At least that's how Shirer depicts it. I don't really know the full military details of this situation. So that brings us to the final and shortest part of the book, Part 6, The Fall of the Third Reich. Hitler refused to surrender, and in the end became embroiled in numerous disputes with his generals, many of whom were still somewhat of pragmatists with some eye towards the future and not losing every last one of their men. However, Hitler still held all the power. No one had managed to overthrow him, and he could see no future for Germany beyond his Germany, the 1,000-year Reich that he had imagined and spoken of in his early days. Therefore, what did the lives of anyone matter anymore to him, even of Germans? For him, it was the end of Germany itself. And thus, this final section of the book is just kind of sad in its own way, seeing how attached these leaders had become to their crazed perspectives on the world, at the expense even of those who were supposedly the people that they represented, and those who were close to them. Hitler maintained to the end in a final manifesto that international Jewry were responsible for starting the war and for all of its consequences, including the Holocaust itself. He spent the last few days of his life pondering who should be his successor, as if it mattered, with the Allied troops just miles from Berlin at this point, and his would-be successors tore themselves apart vying for this position that was now worth nothing. They would all be tried as war criminals in a few months at the Nuremberg trials, and most of these top men would be sentenced to death. One of the worst parts of all is the decision of Hitler's right-hand man Goebbels and his wife not only to commit suicide themselves along with Hitler, but also to kill their 6 children rather than leave them to inhabit this fallen Germany in which they saw no future. And that's the rise and fall of the Third Reich. As you can gather by the length of time I've spent talking about it and drawing connections, I found it quite a valuable read. Aside from maybe that one gap I mentioned earlier about how we didn't hear much perspective from the people in the early territories being annexed by Hitler's Third Reich, like the Austrians and the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, I really noticed no major gaps to speak of. I'm sure there are some others, but I'm not an expert, of course. I still do want to mention one final criticism of the author's attitude towards Germany, which is not my original idea, but is one that I heard about elsewhere, but that I find interesting. There is a particular way of looking at German history that's called the Sonderweg theory, which translates to something like the special path in English. The essence of this theory is that the German nation developed through history in a unique way that basically ensured the ultimate rise of the Nazi Party. One implication of this is that even if Hitler's leadership had somehow been averted, we still would have seen the rise of some Nazi-esque government. And conversely, there was something fundamentally different about, say, France's development, such that we never would have seen France embracing a Nazi-like party during the 20th century. And my understanding is that this theory is out of vogue among historians nowadays, and to me it also seems rather far-fetched. However, at a few significant points in Shirer's narrative, he seems to advocate for this way of looking at the German nation and its people, although I don't think he names it as such, and I didn't know of this theory when first reading it in the book. The first and most jarring instance was towards the beginning of the book when he's briefly discussing the roots of nationalism in Germany. He goes all the way back to Martin Luther, and there's actually a passage where he suggests pretty explicitly that Luther had a lot in common with the Nazis that would eventually succeed him many years later, like that he laid the groundwork for the Nazi regime. Now, maybe it's worth trying to connect these dots in a very loose way. The Sonderweg hypothesis doesn't necessarily have to go back as far as Luther either, but Shirer doesn't really connect any of these dots. It's kind of a throwaway statement, and thus it feels incredibly out of place for him to make such a sweeping historical statement and only spend a page or so focusing on it for the entire first part of the book. It feels a little bit nitpicky to bring this up because it doesn't really much influence our interpretation, and he doesn't really dwell on it much after that. It's kind of irrelevant to the actual telling of the events, what happened 100, 200, 400 years ago that may have influenced the eventual development of Germany. However, I found it interesting because at the time, in conjunction with this book, I'd started listening to Helmut Walser-Smith's more recent book, Germany, A Nation in Its Time, Before, During, and After Nationalism, which explores the development of nationalism in Germany from the 1500s, essentially from a time before this whole concept of the nation really even existed, up through the present. In that book, the author basically argues to the contrary, that yes, there were instances of nationalism going back very far, but before its specific outgrowth into the German nationalism that was espoused in the Nazi Party, this was by no means preordained, certainly not from the time of Luther. And he suggests that, for example, around the time of the French Revolution, French nationalism was actually a more potent and potentially more volatile force than any nationalism that existed in Germany at the same time. I think it's important to consider all of this, though, because how we look at Germany in history and in the present is a crucial foundation for any lessons we draw from this story. In an afterword written 30 years after the book's original publication, so in 1990, looking at the reunification of East and West Germany, Shirer once again returns to this musing even more strongly, warning readers that although public attitudes towards Germany have softened considerably in the years since the book's publication, he's skeptical that Germany can be trusted and basically warns Germany's neighbors to sleep with one eye open. Okay, so maybe that's true in the sense that any modern nation should probably be viewed with some suspicion for similar reasons. But Shirer is talking about Germany in the singular here. Is there a solution to the German problem? He muses, echoing Hitler's own phrasing in what seems, if nothing else, like very poor taste. It's very bizarre. By singling out Germany, it feels as if he's lost much of the broader relevance and importance of this entire book and the lessons that we can all learn from it. Somewhat amusingly, this entire afterward seems to be him punching back against his critics, the Germans being some of his most vocal critics because, as he says, they were unable to face up to their past. What the exact nature of this criticism was against him, he doesn't mention. This whole afterword feels sort of petty and is quite strange. Is the Germany of the Third Reich some historical anomaly? Is it something that was always destined to come about from many years earlier and something that would never be repeated in other nations or contexts? Absolutely not. To truly read this book is to look into a series of historical developments that were neither exceptional nor a foregone conclusion, and to draw the necessary parallels between many events of human history, including up to the present day. That's all I have to say, and as for my recommendation, I think if you're still listening to this review, then you have the patience and interest in this topic that would be needed to really appreciate this historical account. And it's really just a matter of whether you would want to spend the time to focus on it right now. Thanks for watching.